Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into one of history's most tragic ironies, how the peace settlement meant to end World War I actually ended up laying the fragile, explosive foundations for an even darker century. It's a massive paradox, right? The very treaty designed to end all wars directly caused an even greater catastrophe. Instead of locking in a lasting peace, the decisions made back in 1919 literally paved the way to World War II. It's a pretty sobering reminder that winning on the battlefield is completely different from actually building a sustainable peace at the negotiating table. Act 1. The Illusion of Peace.
So picture the scene in Paris, 1919. The atmosphere is hopeful, but frankly, incredibly tense. World leaders, you've probably heard them called the Big Three, are gathering after 4 years of absolute devastation. Millions are dead. Then U.S. President Woodrow Wilson arrives to this massive public fanfare. He brings a vision defined by idealism, a blueprint for a just international order. We're talking open diplomacy, freedom of the seas, reducing weapons, and national self-determination for people emerging from all these collapsing European empires.
Now, he'd actually laid out this exact blueprint to Congress a year earlier, on January 8, 1918. You know it as the 14 points. And the most ambitious one? That was the 14th point. It called for a General Association of Nations, what became the League of Nations, which was specifically designed to peacefully resolve future conflicts. It was a deeply, deeply idealistic proposal, way more optimistic than anything the exhausted European leaders were putting on the table. But here's where Wilson's idealism hits a brick wall: European reality. While Wilson is pushing for open cooperation, the exhausted allies just want revenge. British Prime Minister David Lloyd George had to balance economic realism with intense pressure from voters back home. Voters who literally campaigned on squeezing Germany until the pips squeak. And then you have French Premier Georges Clemenceau. They called him the Tiger, and he demanded harsh, absolutely uncompromising punishment for Germany. To really understand Clemenceau's fierce stance, you have to wrap your head around the scale of the devastation. 1.4 million. That is how many soldiers France lost, and that's alongside the total destruction of its northeastern industrial heartland. This unimaginable loss just hardened Clemenceau's resolve. For him, the absolute guarantee was that Germany had to pay in full, and they could never, ever invade French soil again.
That brings us to Act 2, the dictated peace.
Fast forward exactly 5 years to the day after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand triggered the whole war. The scene is set in the Grand Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles. Talk about symbolic timing and placement, right? This is the exact same room where the German Empire was proudly proclaimed back in 1871. But now, German delegates were totally excluded from the actual negotiations. They were just handed the final terms and forced to sign under fierce protest. They didn't see this as a treaty at all. To them, it was a dictated peace.
And at the very heart of their outrage was Article 231, which you'll usually hear called the War Guilt Clause. This essentially forced Germany to accept sole responsibility for causing the entire war. So by making Germany legally responsible for every bit of loss and damage, it provided the direct legal justification for the severe financial penalties that were about to drop. And these financial penalties? Truly monumental. In 1921, they were set at $33 billion. To put that into perspective, this was a staggering, almost unimaginable sum back then. It was deliberately designed to cripple Germany, all while paying off massive Allied war debts that were, by the way, owed largely to American banks.
But it wasn't just financial ruin. Germany was systematically stripped. They lost vital territory, like Alsace-Lorraine going back to France, and the Polish corridor going to a newly reconstituted Poland. Oh, and they lost all their overseas colonies, too. Militarily, they were reduced to what was basically a police force of 100,000 men. No air force, no submarines allowed, period. On top of that, the coal-rich Saar region was taken under League administration, and the Rhineland was completely demilitarized.
Which leads us directly into Act 3, the fallout. These harsh terms pretty much instantly triggered a cascade of global instability. Back in the US, you had fierce Senate opposition pushing the country right into isolationism, basically refusing binding European security commitments or even joining the League of Nations. The big worry was American sovereignty, specifically over rules that seemed to force the US to defend League members without Congress officially declaring war. Wilson actually went on this grueling nationwide speaking tour to fight for it, a tour that literally ended with him suffering a debilitating stroke. But despite all that, the U.S. Senate rejected the treaty, which severely weakened the new international organization right out of the gate. Meanwhile, back across the Atlantic, Germany's new post-war government, the Weimar Republic, is struggling desperately.
born right in the middle of revolutionary unrest. They're trying to rebuild a shattered wartime economy while somehow meeting those crushing reparation payments. The numbers here are just unbelievable. Imagine needing to take a literal wheelbarrow full of cash just to go buy a loaf of bread. By November 1923, prices were doubling roughly every 2 days, and the exchange rate hit over 4 trillion marks to a single US dollar.
This phenomenon, known as hyperinflation, completely wiped out the life savings of millions of middle-class Germans practically overnight. And this total economic collapse, mixed with deep national humiliation, created a really dangerous situation. It made those financially ruined citizens incredibly receptive to extremist political movements that were promising a return to order and greatness. And Adolf Hitler eagerly exploited that national humiliation and economic suffering. It became his primary propaganda tool. In 1923, right after his failed beer hall putsch, he wrote Mein Kampf, where he laid out these exact anti-Versailles grievances. Fast forward to 1933, Hitler and the Nazi Party rise to power with an explicit promise to overturn the hated treaty. He then systematically dismantled it, remilitarizing the Rhineland in 1936, annexing Austria in 1938. And through all of this, Britain, France, and a severely weakened League of Nations basically just stood by, completely failing to enforce collective security.
And that brings us to Act 4, a new foundation. The catastrophic failure of that 1919 system ultimately resulted in World War II, a global catastrophe far, far greater in scale than the War of Versailles was actually designed to prevent. But, learning from those bitter ashes, post-1945 international law was built to ensure this wouldn't happen a third time. We see the results of that today in the United Nations Charter, which heavily prioritizes multilateral diplomacy. They smartly included permanent Security Council seats with veto power to keep the major players engaged and at the table, deliberately avoiding that American isolationism we saw after 1919. They also established the post-war Nuremberg trials and the International Court of Justice. The goal here was to finally replace punitive victors' justice with durable, rules-based cooperation. As we wrap up this explainer, we have to look back at the big three, standing in that grand hall of mirrors in Paris, and ask ourselves a lingering question. By demanding ultimate punishment over true reconciliation, did the victors at Versailles guarantee the very tragedy they hoped to prevent? It's a really profound thought, and it shows just how deeply the long dark shadow of Versailles shaped the world we live in today. Thanks for joining me.